here we are. I'm Metta Spencer. I'm here in Toronto, and we're going to have a conversation with some of my friends about nuclear weapons and about the effort to get rid of them, disarm all of the nuclear weapons in the world, which is something that all of us want to do. I have three friends with me. The first one, who I will call on him in a bit, and it is Douglas Roche, who was his writer. His career has been in writing many, many books, and he was Canada's disarmament ambassador when I first met him, and then became a senator of Canada, but has continued, as long as I've known him, to work toward nuclear disarmament. And there's nobody that I have more respect for than a man who's devoted his whole life to this issue. We will also have another very fine Canadian diplomat, Earl Turcotte, who is a former diplomat for Canada. He worked on, especially, I think his heart was in working on the munitions treaty to ban cluster bombs and things of that kind. I'm not using the right terminology for that kind of treaty, but at any rate, he can explain it to us in a bit. And finally, we have Erin Hunt. Erin is a program coordinator for Mines Action Canada, which is an NGO based in Ottawa. And it's an organization that works to make sure that the treaty on the banning of landmines is fulfilled. So we have it's a civil society organization, but it has a lot of influence in terms of monitoring the compliance with the treaty on landmines. So each of these people know each other, and we'll all be chatting. So I want to start off by, of course, right now, as we all know, we're in some of the worst period of risk that we can remember in our lifetime. And Doug Roche has seen plenty of scary things about nuclear weapons. And I think, Doug, maybe you can give us some sort of a history of how we got this far. What has gone wrong? Why don't we have these horrible weapons abolished by now? Doug?
Well, thank you, Metta. Thank you, Metta. It's really a sad and dangerous situation for the world that we've lived since 1945 with the continued development of nuclear weapons. And there was a time about 20 years ago when the Cold War had ended and states were beginning to cooperate in a better manner. And we had some hope that the actual reductions in nuclear weapons which were taking place would continue on and open up a pathway to comprehensive negotiations for the total elimination of nuclear weapons. But that corner has been turned, and we're now in a situation where the diplomacy that is necessary for nuclear disarmament to take place is failing miserably. And states, particularly the two major states in this field, the United States and Russia, which possess 95% of the 15,000 nuclear weapons in the world, these two states, instead of cooperating for the good of humanity, are hurling invectives at each other. And the leadership of both states, Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin, have animosities that their governments are exacerbating. And so I feel that the lack of public opinion in the world, the lack of political will, the lack adherence to the legal obligation that states are under to eliminate nuclear weapons, all of that is just set us into a new and very discouraging period in world history. And for myself, I feel really quite alarmed at the tenor of the discussions that are taking place today. They're nowhere near the manner of cooperation that existed some 20 years ago, as I said. Mm-hmm. So how do we cover this, and how do we cover the hope that people can have, and that civil society exerting a renewed sense of public opinion and pressure on governments? And since we're all in Canada here, particularly the Canadian government, to assume its responsibilities on behalf of humanity, that is a great challenge that we're facing. And I hope that in this discussion, we can try to find ways to advance this discussion rather than giving in to the discouragements that are prevailing.
Exactly. I think there was a time I remember being so thrilled when Reagan and Gorbachev met in Reykjavik, Iceland, and they came within a hair's breadth of actually deciding to eliminate all of the nuclear weapons they owned. And somehow that fell through, and we reached a point where we're in right now, both of the what used to be called superpowers. I don't know that you call Russia a superpower anymore, but they're building more and more, intending to increase the armament rather than diminish them, as I understand it.
Well, you mentioned Reykjavik, where at Iceland, the capital of Iceland, where the two leaders met in 1986, and indeed there was sort of a spontaneity for a few moments about getting rid of all nuclear weapons, from both sides, but their advisors were horrified, and nothing ever came of it, except for one very important dictum that came out of that meeting, when both Reagan and Gorbachev, on behalf of their countries, agreed that a nuclear war cannot be won and
must never be fought.
And I think we'd see a path.
Okay. I think we're having a problem with your audio, Doug. Let's ask Earl to chime in here, because what are your memories of that period and your sense, Earl, of the trajectory that we've been through during these last decades since Reykjavik, if nothing else? What did you have many hopes at that time, and what went wrong?
Well, Metta, first of all, I'll qualify my comments by saying that most of my background with both the government of Canada and the United Nations was with respect to conventional weapons. But I have watched from a distance as colleagues have been involved in negotiations in various fora over the years. And I can tell you, even observing from the sidelines, you got a deep sense of frustration, and that frustration continues despite the fact that there have been some milestones in a positive direction. I mean, first of all, I would like to just absolutely reinforce the comments that you and Doug have made. I think this is not just I, but many thousands, if not millions of people around the world believe that there is at least as high a level of risk of a nuclear detonation today as there was at any point during the Cold War, and that includes 1963. So, these are very serious times, and it truly is, in my view, just a matter of time before there is another nuclear event, whether it's by design, a deliberate attack, or by accident or human miscalculation. So we need to act, and we need to act fast to prevent it. Mm-hmm. I'd like to just make reference to a couple of the milestones that gave us a glimmer of hope along the way. Because, the Antarctic treaty was established in 1959 that prohibits any military measures in Antarctica. We have the Partial Test Ban Treaty of 1963, the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 that dictated that activities in space should be for peaceful purposes only. Then the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1970, that includes Article 6, obligation to pursue good faith measures towards total nuclear disarmament. That has not happened. It may have had some measured success with respect to non-proliferation, but certainly no success to date on actual nuclear disarmament. Mm-hmm. So there have been other milestones along the way, but I think the most significant one is the establishment of 5 nuclear weapons-free zones that actually incorporate 115 countries, I believe, in the world, and a good portion of the population. What we have to do now is to universalize that, and the most remarkable development of all was the establishment of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons that was just negotiated last year, or over the course of about 15 months. And Erin can speak to that far more directly because she participated in some of the negotiations. But I believe that is a remarkable development. The treaty was endorsed by 122 of 124 participating countries, and it includes a legal obligation. In addition to all the prohibitions, it includes a positive obligation on states parties to universalize the treaty, to try to get all nations to adhere to it. So that, I think, is going to manifest itself into action with states, and we can talk about the support that civil society can offer as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, certainly that is the only, almost the only positive sign that we have on the horizon, really, and it has been a great thrill. Of course, the people who took the initiative in making this treaty happen, ICANN, have actually won the Nobel Peace Prize, and I must say, the thing is that this approach, this was constituted quite a shift in thinking about nuclear weapons. It seems to me that a number of people were frustrated time after time, year after year, when the Conference on Disarmament kept meeting, and it was supposed to be the place where nuclear disarmament would take place, and there has been no progress. What is it, 21 years? Somebody actually can tell me when that happened. If
I may, Metta, it's been it was over 20 years without agreement even on a program of work. And the big problem with the Conference on Disarmament is, first of all, it's a closed club of 65 countries. Other countries can observe, but they're closed to participation. Secondly, it operates on the basis of consensus decision-making, which has been misinterpreted to mean that there must be unanimous agreement before anything is agreed. That is a recipe for paralysis, and that is why, in my view and the view of many others, the Conference on Disarmament is a moribund form.
So now, who are these 65 countries, and how do you get to be one of them? Was this set up originally? Were these countries named to this this conference? And what have they been doing all this time? Obviously, the nuclear powers don't want to get rid of their weapons. That they are the ones, I assume, that completely stall any kind of effort to really begin to disarm. So with in effect a veto power in the Conference on Disarmament, the nuclear weapon states can keep things from moving at all, right? And am I wrong?
Metta, perhaps Erin might tell us a little bit about the Prohibition Treaty, and because it does offer a little bit of hope.
Oh yes, yeah. Erin has been going down, or was going down throughout the summer, to be party to and witness and engage in with other civil society organizations as the treaty was being negotiated at the United Nations. So what was that like, Erin, and what were the issues that were being discussed there?
Yeah, well, I think to start with, I do have to make some apologies. My cat has decided that right now is when he wants to freak out. So I'm not scratching things or anything like that.
Okay.
That's just the cat. So I think where we need to begin is what you were talking about with the shift in conversation about nuclear weapons. As you guys have all said, the Conference on Disarmament has been moribund, is I think the most common word used to describe it. But what really got us going on this this treaty was the shift in discussion from a sort of arms control basis to talking about the humanitarian initiative and the humanitarian impacts of the weapon. And that shift of conversation came out of all the work that had been done on landmines when that's how we got the Ottawa Treaty, was you started talking about the humanitarian impact of the weapon and stopped talking about the military utility. Mm-hmm. With the Cluster Munitions Convention, same idea, talk about the humanitarian impact, you get progress. So that's the sort of the framework that brought us to the negotiations. Mm-hmm. And
there were about 3 conferences along the way that developed that humanitarian. They focused on the humanitarian impact of actually using nuclear weapons. Where were those? I think one was in Oslo. Was that hosted by the Norwegian government or what?
So the first one was hosted in Oslo by the Norwegian government. The second was in Nayarit, Mexico. And the third was in Vienna, Austria. Mm-hmm. And then there was an open-ended working group in under the auspices of the United Nations General Assembly in 2016. And that open-ended working group is what recommended that negotiations start. And the UN General Assembly voted to start negotiations in 2017. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the negotiations were chaired by the Costa Rican ambassador, and we saw she was really good at making sure civil society was able to participate. Mm-hmm. So as you mentioned, I was part of the civil society negotiating team for the treaty. What ICANN had done is we've organized ourselves into regional sort of advocacy teams, as well as some thematic teams. And the team I worked with was the Positive Obligations team. So
let's explain first what ICANN is. I think I remember being in Ottawa and in Parliament Hill when there was a big party about 15 years ago when ICANN was launched. What is ICANN?
So ICANN was founded in 2007 in Australia. It's the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. So it's an international network of civil society organizations campaigning for a nuclear ban treaty.
It can be co-sponsored by a number of other civil society organizations, or what? How does it work? It's not just an organization, is it?
No, so it's a coalition. It's a campaign. It has a very small staff team, and it has an international steering group of a small number of organizations, and then there's about 400 organizations around the world that are part of ICANN that join the call, work for the ban, and collaborate, and we work together to campaign either at national or international levels.
Now, was this from the beginning meant to be an organization that would highlight the actual effects on human beings of suffering, the impact of the weapons? Was that the focus from the outset of ICANN, or did that orientation toward discussing the humanitarian impact arise as time wore on and as the campaign progressed. Do you know how that came about?
Yeah. Well, I wasn't there at the start, but I do know that the inspiration came from the International Campaign to Ban Landmines, which has always looked at the humanitarian impact of weapons. So that whole idea was definitely on the radar, especially was one of the original organizations was the International Physicians for Prevention of Nuclear War, and doctors are very well aware of the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons.
Mm-hmm.
They're the ones who have to treat them.
So they had these 3 conferences in about, what, a year and a half or so within that period of time. And they were people, civil society people went and they testified. As I remember, people actually saying, what it felt like to be bombed. And we had this, our own friend, Setsuko Thurlow, a Canadian here in Toronto, who was always ready to tell her story as being one of the victims of the Hiroshima bomb as a 13-year-old girl. So that focus on the humanitarian impact, I think what it did, didn't it, was it shifted. It said, yes, you guys are always talking about how many bombs can we afford to get rid of and still maintain our supremacy and keep parity with the other side? And, what would, how can we keep ourselves secure if we let go of some of our weapons? We certainly need these to protect ourselves. And that mentality, that military orientation, simply has dominated the discourse everywhere until this ICAN movement began to shift it toward thinking about, no, you can't do this against human beings no matter what condition. This is not an acceptable way to ever behave, and you can never use one of these weapons. That kind of a focus was, I think, a really refreshing change. And I bet you saw it coming. Did you attend any of these sessions before the negotiations began at the UN, Erin?
Yes, I was in Oslo for the Civil Society Forum before the Oslo meeting, but civil society participation was a little limited there. And I was involved in the Vienna meetings as well as the open-ended working group in 2016.
I went to one of the open-ended working groups a couple of years before. I guess it was the first one in the series in Geneva. It hadn't really taken off yet, I didn't think. But it sounded as if, as you got closer, many countries began to get on board.
Yeah. There was definitely a core group. Sorry?
Yes. Which were the core groups, and did you get acquainted? Go ahead.
Yeah. So the core group included Austria and Ireland, South Africa, Costa Rica, Mexico, and I'm sure I'm forgetting somebody right now, when I apologize to that country. Who?
Maybe
Ireland.
I thought I said Ireland.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and those states were key in getting other countries on board and sort of helping to shape the negotiations as they went forward.
Mm-hmm. Now the General Assembly, was it, that authorized the actual treaty negotiations, which took place, there were 2 sessions, weren't there, in New York?
Yeah, there was a 1-week session in March. So we're coming up next week to the 1-year anniversary of the start of negotiations. Mm-hmm. And then there was a 3-week session in June and July, ending on July 7th.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Did either of you participate in that? Earl and Doug, were you down there? I know a lot of Canadians went down. I didn't, but were either of you at the negotiations?
I was not able to.
Okay, yeah, you watched it from afar. But you have a lot of experience as a negotiator in building treaties Can you compare what you know about this process, Earl, to the experiences that you had in working on things like the cluster bombs and so on?
Thanks, Metta. Well, first of all, as Erin has already said, there were parallels in this process to the Mine Ban Treaty. And the Mine Ban Treaty is very interesting because for many, many years, states with support from civil society had tried to get a mandate to negotiate a ban on anti-personnel landmines in what is called the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons deemed to be excessively injurious or to have indiscriminate effects, or CCW for short. Now, that is the UN body that was charged with responsibility for addressing conventional weapons. The Conference on Disarmament was the UN body originally designated to deal with weapons of mass destruction. Both of them operate on the basis of consensus decision-making, and both of them have been painfully slow in producing anything of significance as a result. We've already spoken about the CD. So in frustration, states essentially took it outside the traditional UN architecture. And in the case of Canada, our former Liberal government, when Mr. Chrétien was Prime Minister and Lloyd Axworthy was Minister of Foreign Affairs, took the initiative in essentially putting a challenge out to states to come together in an ad hoc forum and to negotiate a ban on anti-personnel landmines. That process, by the way, and very important, they used democratic rules of procedure so that no one state or no small group of states could hold up progress for everyone else. That process was replicated with the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, with the Convention on Cluster Munitions. And in 07 and 08, over a 15-month period, very similarly, they negotiated a ban on cluster munitions. The TPNW has followed a similar process by taking the matter to the General Assembly and operating using democratic rules of procedure. They got an overwhelming mandate to negotiate, and roughly 2/3 of the world's states did participate in negotiations. Unfortunately, not our own and not any of the nuclear armed states, but we can get to that in a moment. So there are a lot of parallels, but this is a remarkable treaty. It is a categorical prohibition on nuclear weapons that applies to states parties, of course. And nuclear armed states claim that it has absolutely no bearing or no influence on them or their policies. They do not consider that this will in any way constitute forgetting the legal term, but international humanitarian law that would apply to states that do not voluntarily become party to the treaty. So the challenge for the international community is to use whatever influence we can, positive and negative, to induce them to become party to the treaty. I expect that the 122 states that have already endorsed the treaty are going to all become signatories and ratify and become full states parties over time.
Okay. Now that's a really important point.
Maybe I'm a hopeless optimist, but I think, having had a bit of experience with the Convention on Cluster Munitions, I think that any state that participated in the negotiations and endorsed the text, that it is just a matter of time before they do the necessary domestically to put appropriate domestic legislation in place and whatnot, so that they too become party. And I think you will see, I know there are over 50 signatories. I think there are 53 or 54 now. And
57.
57, wonderful.
I'm sorry.
How many ratifications there?
I'm sorry, are you saying that there are 57 states that have ratified it?
No, signed.
Signed it. All right. Okay. But only about 5 that have ratified it so far. How long does it normally take, Earl, for states to move on from voting for it to signing it and then to ratifying it?
Well, it varies from state to state. It depends on what their domestic legal requirements are. But in the case of Canada, I know that it requires that Canada pass any domestic legislation that is required that will allow it to fulfill its international obligations. And it takes a fair bit of time, usually a couple of years, to get a bill through that eventually becomes law. So I suspect that you will see over the next couple of years a significant number of those 122 states become, if they haven't already signed, most of them will probably simply do it in a single process of signing and then ratifying. And they submit their instruments of ratification to the depositary, which in this case is a Secretary General of the United Nations.
I'm glad to hear you say that, because I was beginning to think maybe it's time for us to start being pessimistic, because I know that, of course, the U.S. is going to be twisting arms. They will do all kinds of things to try to keep other countries from signing a document that they don't want them to sign or ratifying it. And so having heard that only 7 have ratified it so far, I was beginning to worry. But you think it takes a long time, and don't worry yet. Is that it? Okay. Now the argument is sorry, go ahead. Yeah, Doug. Yes.
Well, yes. Put it on NATO countries and not nations.
We're not hearing your sound. Yeah, there's a problem with your sound, Doug.
Well, I think about
I don't know what to do. Erin, can you hear him?
No, I can't. But just sort of, I think I know possibly where Doug was going with some of that.
Okay.
We've lost
one thing to keep in mind when you're talking about U.S. pressure on this treaty is, in some cases, so what we've seen is the more pressure that is placed on states, the more likely they are to support the treaty.
Oh.
There was at least one instance where we believe there was a meeting where they walked out of that meeting, and all of a sudden there were more countries supporting the resolution for or co-sponsoring the resolution for the negotiations.
We're losing your audio, Erin.
And the negotiations actually owe their best press coverage to U.S. Ambassador Nikki Haley. Pardon?
Oh, yes, I hear you. U.S. Ambassador Haley inadvertently brought people to the side of the treaty by dissing, I guess. Is that what she did?
Yeah, well, she held a press conference condemning the negotiations on the day they started, which ensured that there was much more press coverage of the start of the negotiations than there probably would have been. And of course, that meant that ICANN people had to get ICANN's statement as a response to her press conference. Mm-hmm. So there is some, sometimes the pressure backfires. But even if you're looking at countries that are like Canada in NATO, there is ways to engage with the treaty, even if they're not going to sign and ratify in the next couple of years. There's provisions in the treaty for support to victims of nuclear weapons detonations and support to countries that need to rehabilitate the environment. This is the first treaty that has a recognition of the disproportionate impact weapons have on Indigenous populations and recognizing Indigenous rights. The treaty also talks about the different impact nuclear weapons have on women and girls as opposed to men and boys, and it recognizes the importance of inclusive participation in disarmament. So these are all things that countries like Canada and states that are maybe a little unsure of whether they want to join the treaty yet, these are all things they can participate with. They can support, cleaning up the Marshall Islands. They can support survivors of nuclear weapons testing in Kazakhstan. So there's all these different ways that you can get involved in the treaty now, while you're undergoing discussions of whether or not it works to negotiate. And I think one of the reasons we have these is because of the involvement of civil society in the treaty. We saw a lot of the ICANN delegation was very diverse globally. It had large numbers of, it was led by women, had large numbers of young people. I think at some points, I think our average age might have been 30, maybe 35. We saw like LGBTQ campaigners playing a large role. Indigenous organizations from areas that have had nuclear weapons testing were hugely important. So we had a very diverse campaigns. We've got all these different voices reflected in the treaty and these are the kind of voices that Canada is looking to push forward on the international stage. So there's potential here for Canada to get involved.
Oh, you mean because of the young people, because of Indigenous support and so on, that this might even influence Canada's decision about supporting the treaty? I hadn't heard that argument before.
Yeah, well, a lot of...
Metta,
yes, sorry.
I think we have Doug back, but I think, Doug, your mic is muted. If you can unmute the mic, I'd love to hear you comment on particularly what we were talking about earlier when we lost your audio about the pressure that's being brought to bear by some of the major nuclear powers on our allies not to participate.
Okay, Doug, let's hear you now.
Can you hear?
Yeah?
Can you?
Not very well.
You can hear?
You're coming in and out.
It's patchy, but go ahead and try. We'll strain our ears to hear you. Go on.
Well, I do think that we need to consider this conversation in Canada with respect to signing the Prohibition Treaty, and I was trying to point out a few minutes ago that they opposed to the treaty and put pressure on all the NATO countries not to participate, let alone and to sign it. And that pressure has gone to NATO into sanguine, as I think my colleagues were a few minutes ago, that this treaty is going to be easily entered into force with the 50 ratifications. I mean, I think it's going to be a slow process. But in any event, it is important that Canada step up and regain its role as a middle power, exerting pressure on the nuclear weapon states to cease and desist the nuclear arms race and to fulfill their obligations. They have very strong existing legal obligations to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And the reason we have the Prohibition Treaty is because the nuclear power states, have not honored their legal obligations to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And thus that created an immense amount of frustration among non-nuclear states. And it was that frustration, along with the energy of the ICANN movement and related other movements, that led to the development of the Prohibition Treaty. So let us not get too confused for our audience here. Canada should definitely sign the Prohibition Treaty, but sign it recognizing that it has to put pressure on NATO to change its policies, which still to this very day proclaim nuclear weapons as essential and a supreme guarantee of security. That is an immense falsehood that has been visited upon the world. And Canada, in former years, did step up to the plate. We had the present Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau. His father, Pierre Trudeau, when he was the Prime Minister, went around the world to all the nuclear weapon major states, calling for them to cease the nuclear arms race. And he did make an impact. And it was Mr. Gorbachev who himself told me personally that the influence of Canada and Pierre Trudeau was very significant in the gains that were made on nuclear disarmament in the 1980s. And so I think that the present government needs to recover some spunk, the same kind of spunk that they had when they started, as Erin was describing, the Landmines Treaty, which came about in 1997. That was a period of hope and drive and energy by civil society working with governments, and that has to be recovered. And there's many, many civil society people who do want to recover it, but I do not see the same sense of desire on the part of the government. The government has retreated and reacted against the very pressures that are building up that have led to the Prohibition Treaty. So we're living now in a time of great confusion and danger, and I think that those of us who have some access to this issue and who have access to the government of Canada need to maintain the pressure on the politicians, and particularly the parliamentarians in the Canadian Parliament. And bearing in mind that there's an election coming in 2019, in a little more than a year from now, and we need to hold their feet to the fire on what they're going to do about Canada regaining its role in nuclear disarmament.
Mm-hmm, absolutely, and I think everybody on this panel probably agrees. I would imagine almost certainly we agree to it. I think we ought to give a little thought to how to answer the kinds of arguments that the Canadian government or any NATO government, most of the NATO governments put forward, because as I understand it, the U.S. and all the NATO country or the nuclear weapons countries justify this in the name of deterrence. That unless you have nuclear weapons to use to deter your enemies, you're vulnerable, and that these are the major source of security. And Canada argue that, yeah.
Metta, you're calling for an answer to the Canadian government's negative position. The answer is that an organization called the Canadians for Nuclear Weapons Convention, which has produced 1,000 members of the Order of Canada signing a statement calling for Canada to take vigorous diplomatic action in line with the Secretary General's call for a nuclear weapons convention. The Canadians for Nuclear Weapons Convention sent a letter on November the 15th, 2017, to the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, in which we answered every one of the arguments that the Canadian government had put forward against the Prohibition Treaty. That is a detailed, full answer of every point. And to this day, the Canadian government has not even responded to the letter sent on behalf of 1,000 members of the Order of Canada. This is the most prestigious group in Canada. So I'm trying to tell you and our audience here that we're in a very serious situation when the government of Canada thinks that it can ignore the expressed full opinion of very important people in this country. Why are we allowing them to get away with this? This is a very serious question.
Well, they already had passed, both houses of Parliament had passed, had endorsed a resolution a couple of years before, 2 or 3 years before, calling for nuclear disarmament.
In 2010, the Senate and the House of Commons passed unanimously a motion calling for the Canadian government to take a vigorous worldwide diplomatic initiative on behalf of nuclear disarmament. that unanimous motion of the Canadian Parliament was also ignored by the government of Canada. I mean, it is really shocking that the government has been so dismissive of important expressions of opinion. So I mean, you can see in the very manner that I'm speaking now my own frustration, and it's the frustration that was felt widely through the humanitarian movement around the world that started the process that led, as Erin described, to the Prohibition Treaty. So right now, I'll just make one more point in this context. We're now coming up to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is the largest multilateral arms control treaty in the world. It's signed by 191 states. And it calls under Article 6 for the pursuit of comprehensive negotiations for the elimination of nuclear weapons. Now we're coming up to the 50th anniversary of the treaty in 2020. And this treaty is slowly, now quickly, eroding in importance because it has been ignored by the main states, and the obligation to pursue negotiations under Article 6 has been reinforced by the International Court of Justice, which 20 years ago issued a statement saying that a unanimous statement by the International Court of Justice, the highest court in the world, a unanimous statement saying that not only states have a duty to pursue, states have a duty to conclude negotiations for the elimination of nuclear weapons. So we have a very strong legal base on which to stand, and we need to combine that now with a political will. And, 30 years ago, or whatever, in 1982, 1 million people marched in New York City. I was one of them.
I was too.
Well, Metta, you and I remember the march from the United Nations to Central Park in New York of 1 million people against nuclear arms and the deployment of cruise and Pershing missiles that was going on in Europe at the time. And that did lead to action. It led to the Reykjavik summit of 1986 that almost eliminated nuclear weapons. So we've fallen back, and a whole lot of things have happened. But we've got to recover our sense of purpose, our sense of responsibility, our sense of destiny to protect humanity from another kind of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that, as Earl said a little earlier in this conversation, is just waiting to happen.
Well, bless you. And absolutely, I think now we have to think about how we're going to do it. The concern that I have is, yes, you're certainly right that the Canadian government seems to completely ignore public opinion on this. However, I once did a little research, and I tried to find every poll that I could where people around the world had been asked whether they want nuclear disarmament. And, Canadians were right up close to the top in terms of, almost everybody, every country in the world, except maybe one, I think, at one point, said that the majority of people said they want nuclear disarmament. Canada, last one was, I think, 88% of the Canadian population wants it. And even the Liberal Party, when they had their conference, they decided that this was their official policy, but then they don't do it. The question is, I think that even though the Canadian population, just like the rest of the world, have been rather, well, certainly they say they want nuclear disarmament. It's like, yes, I wish, peace on earth, but I don't really think it's possible. I wish for health and well-being for everybody, but we know that you can't really have it. That kind of passivity going along with the right kind of wishes, but simply not the energy that needs to be exercised to make it come true. How do we get people to exercise the passion for getting this thing done? Do we have to wait until one of the things actually goes off and people then say, this is unacceptable. Well, in fact, there was this thing in Hawaii a few weeks ago that scared the daylights out of people in Hawaii, but I haven't heard anything more about it since then. What does it take, and what do we have to do to make people aware of the urgency of getting rid of these weapons? Earl and Erin, have you given thought to what our next steps have to be to make this happen?
If I might, Metta, first of all, I know that we have an audience outside of Canada, an international audience, but if I could just for a moment focus on the Canadian situation, as has been pointed out, I mean, Canada as a NATO state is in a difficult position on one hand, because we are subject to the bully tactics and whatnot that the United States and also the United Kingdom and France, the three NATO nuclear armed states, have been employing to ensure that their allies support them in the boycott, first of all, of the negotiations, and also the continued dismissal of the TPNW. But we are also in a very good position by virtue of being a NATO state to bring concerns forward to other NATO countries should we be inclined to do so. And I think we have to keep working on our government. Now, I'm maybe hopelessly optimistic, but I think once the North American Free Trade Agreement trade negotiations have been brought to conclusion, Canada might be a little more inclined to be independent-minded, or at least publicly so, in our foreign policy, or in our policies generally speaking. Right now, that is a major preoccupation for our government. It, no pun intended, but it trumps almost everything else. We are being obedient to the point of obsequiousness with respect to our key trading partner, in my view. I hope that will change when NAFTA negotiations are brought to conclusion. I do think the pressure that's being brought to bear by Canadian and international civil society, and now that we have the positive obligation in place with the treaty, states hopefully will bring diplomatic and other pressure to bear on other states, such as our own, that fall outside the treaty. And I know from my past experience, and certainly former Disarmament Ambassador Roche and knows from firsthand experience how effective it can be when senior diplomats and political leaders from one nation actually raise an issue in bilateral and multilateral discussions with other states. So we have to maintain the pressure, and it's going to take, I think, a momentum that is unprecedented to get rid of nuclear weapons. As you pointed out and others point out, some people naively still believe that they are the supreme guarantee of national and international security instead of the greatest risk to international security. Anyway, I'll stop at that point. And Erin, over to you.
Yeah. I guess just to sort of start with, we are seeing some movement on the Canadian position with regards to the treaty. Minister Freeland just spoke to the Conference on Disarmament a couple of weeks ago and recognized that I have to move our little screen here to find the text, that the criticisms that we've heard in this call and the criticisms of disarmament not moving forward, that were a key leader in why this treaty happened, are legitimate criticisms. And she also talked about the importance of all states, especially the nuclear armed states, creating a environment that's more conducive to disarmament. And a key way that Canada can do this is through we've been talking about having a feminist foreign policy, and no foreign policy can be considered feminist when you're supporting nuclear weapons. Those are just contradictory, completely and totally contradictory. So when you're looking at how, as Earl said, Canada can be bringing these messages to NATO, there are other states in NATO where their parliaments are looking at the treaty and studying it, and that's something that Canada can do as well. But, you know, as I mentioned earlier with the Indigenous rights and the gender angles in the treaty, these are levers with this government. If this is what Canada wants to do, if Canada wants a feminist foreign policy, if Canada wants reconciliation, this is the sort of policy that they need to be supporting on the international stage. And I guess it's up to Canadians to point that out as much as they can.
Absolutely. Can you also bring us up to date about what about ICANN? Now that they've won the Nobel Peace Prize for their wonderful efforts, and they've triumphed by getting this TPNW so far along. What is next for them? What are they as an organization moving ahead with further steps toward changing public opinion, or what is the game plan for ICANN? You know?
We're just getting started. The treaty is the easy part. Getting the treaty is the easy part. The hard part is universalizing the treaty and implementing the treaty provisions. So that's the focus for the next few years, is entry into force of the treaty and ensuring that the treaty provisions are implemented properly. We're looking at the how to improve victim assistance, how to start or continue environmental remediation, how to universalize the treaty, how to hopefully start how to move U.S. nuclear weapons out of allied countries' territory, all these sorts of things. We're just getting started.
Okay.
Since we only have a couple of minutes left, can I make a plea to members of the audience from states that are party or planning to become party to the treaty? Please encourage, first of all, as I'm sure you have, congratulate your leadership. We wish we had the kind of visionary leadership that your countries do. Please encourage your political leaders and your diplomats to bring pressure to bear on the holdout countries like ours. It is much more effective when it comes from another government, or it is as effective as pressure coming from civil society, and in some cases more so. So please help us out, and we'll continue to keep up the pressure from our side as well. Thank you.
That is a wonderful concluding remark, Earl, because I think we need to do that, to thank those countries that have taken the initiative and have stepped forward as they have. And thank you all for contributing to this conversation. I want to mention what we're going to do next week. This is what I will be doing, I think, in the future, is every Monday night from 8 o'clock until 9 Eastern time, Eastern Daylight Time this time. I'll be having conversations like this on Facebook, the Facebook page of Peace Magazine. I'm the editor of Peace Magazine, and you might want to look at it sometime. We have our own website. But I also want to point out that the topics that I've been choosing for our discussions every Monday night, I've been choosing because they're relevant to another project that I'm engaged in. And that is a project initiated by Science for Peace and a number of other peace organizations in Canada, called How to Save the World in a Hurry. And everybody is trying, I think, to save the world from something or other. Well, most of us at least have some cause that we're devoted to, and certainly all four of us on this conversation tonight have been very keen and working toward the abolition of nuclear weapons. But there are many other threats that need to be addressed as well. Global warming being a threat, some on pretty much the same level of risk, perhaps, as nuclear war. But in addition, there are the problems of famine, problems of pandemics. The Guardian today has a wonderful article about the real growing probability of a horrible pandemic of some kind in just within our lifetime, and my lifetime isn't that much longer. But at any rate, pandemics are a very major threat. The risk of radiation exposure from something like a reactor explosion is the kind of threat that could wipe out 1 billion people under certain circumstances. And finally, cyber attacks, which we now realize are becoming increasingly threatening. I think the U.S. has been just accusing Russia of regularly tampering with and exploring the weaknesses in the electric grid of the U.S. so that they could knock it out in a quick, sharp blow, which would be absolutely catastrophic. So all of these things are threats that are interdependent and causally linked, not 100%, but you can't really solve any one of them without addressing at least one of the others. So these 6 threats are interdependent. And we are developing a list of recommendations or policy proposals that would be, each one could be reduced, let's say 3 or 4 policy proposals for each of these 6 threats. And on May 30th and 31st in Toronto, we will be having a conference and choose the most promising of the public policy proposals that we can put on one piece of paper and call it a platform for survival, which then will address the worst risks and help reduce the risks of all 6 of these major catastrophes. And if you're interested in this, and I think everybody should be, you want to go to our website called tosavetheworld.ca, and you'll find the list of proposals that have been accumulating, as well as a number of other things that will be of interest to you. And you're going to be able to register for that conference there or on the Science for Peace page of Facebook. So I hope you'll take a look at that and then be with me again next week at the same location on Facebook at 8 o'clock. And what we'll be talking about next week is the value of planting billions of trees in the world as a mechanism for reducing climate change. It's a very important fact. So we'll be talking about that next week, and I'll have some very interesting people with me. Thank you for being with us. Good night.
Thank you, Metta.